All right. Well, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Kerr, Executive Director of the Ignatian Solidarity Network, and we're excited to have you with us today. For those who will watch this via recording, and for the important work you will do on Capitol Hill when you visit Washington, D.C. Next month as part of the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice. Really excited for that. Today, we're going to be addressing one of two issue areas, migration. And we're going to talk about kind of the nitty-gritty of these policy elements that we're inviting you to engage in during your visits to Capitol Hill. The purpose of our visit is going to be to demonstrate the unity that we have as a Catholic Church, that we join Pope Francis, the U.S. Catholic bishops, Jesuit leaders, in asking for immigration policy that honors the human dignity and family unity that are core parts of our Catholic teaching. And so that's really the intent around our time on Capitol Hill, is to bring the message of our faith and of people of faith to members of Congress and their staffs. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is kind of dig into that. We have two guests with us. Really excited to have Joanna Williams. Joanna is the Director of Education Advocacy at the Keno Border Initiative in Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. Also with us is Jose Arnulfo Cabrera. Jose is the Director of Education Advocacy for Migration at the Ignatian Solidarity Network, and admittedly, Jose is just upstairs from me, so he's close by. We're going to start kind of working from the border and root causes, and then work our way into the interior. So we'll start with Joanna. We're going to invite Joanna to share for about 15 to 20 minutes or so, depending on how fast she goes. And then we'll invite Jose to talk a little bit about issues related to interior enforcement. And then we'll have a chance for some questions, okay? And so keep track of your questions, write them down, and we'll have a chance to ask questions of both Joanna and Jose when we get to the end of each of their brief presentations, all right? So that way we can have kind of a larger conversation about some of those questions that may have crossover and intersection as well, all right? So we're gonna turn it over to Joanna. She's gonna share some slides, so we're gonna let her make that transition, and we'll go from there. So Joanna, welcome, thanks for being with us, and why don't we turn it over to you.
Yeah, beautiful of you. I'm just coming over from the border center, Sonora, Mexico, and oftentimes we here in Nogales, Sonora, and being on the Mexican side of the border, can feel that their voices aren't being heard in the United States. And so it's really an honor to be able to share with you and have the confidence that you're going to bring these experiences to Capitol Hill, and that what's happening at the border is not just a distant issue, but it's something that's affecting our Ignatian family. And as part of that family, you're going to join with me in speaking and helping amplify the voices of these families. So with that, stories all day, but today the focus is more so on the policy component. So I'm going to share information, or a bit of a presentation, which hopefully you can see at this point, to cover two different sections of the notes. Is that showing up correctly on the slide?
It's not yet.
Yes.
There we go, all right.
You can see it now?
We can.
Oh, okay, lovely. I can't change my own screen now, though. Oh, there we go. All right. So, as I was saying, government policy focused on generating despair and really deterring migration. And as Catholics and also an Ignatian family, what we're proposing is instead to focus on how do we reimagine how we offer protection and accompaniment through people's legal case. So you'll see in the talking points several different policies that are aimed towards generating despair. The expansion of immigration detention, for example, forcing people to go through their legal cases from within detention, is a way of trying to deter migration, trying to generate suffering in a way that then people don't want to seek protection in the U.S. What we propose instead is reimagining that and trying to accompany people through their legal cases. So offering, for example, case management support so that when people are released from detention, when they're in the community seeking asylum, they have a case manager who can help them find an attorney or who could help them with the services in the town so that they're able to be in a position where they can better attend their immigration court and pursue their legal case. So I want to highlight that difference because it's important in the midst of all of these policies to think, what's the core message that we want to communicate to these offices? And the core message is that we, as a U.S. society, are capable of this kind of protection and accompaniment. We're capable of hospitality, and we want to promote policies of hospitality and not policies of despair and of deterrence. So I have, this is mostly the reason that I wanted the slides to work, is to show you a quick graphic that I have here that summarizes some of the issues that are put into the talking points, just so that you could understand how has the asylum process changed in the last 2 years, and what does that mean as far as what we're asking you to advocate for on Capitol Hill. So the top one, what's showing up on my screen is brown or grayish, is the previous version of the asylum process. So it used to be that somebody who is fleeing from southern Mexico, from Central America, from Venezuela, when they would flee their country, they'd be detained at the U.S.-Mexico border. And then if they were a family traveling with kids, they might be released to pursue their immigration case, or they'd be held in detention, in immigration detention in the U.S. And in either case, they'd then be waiting for a court decision on whether they qualify for asylum or not. You can see the graphic in the middle of the screen is a barbed wire fence representing the border. Most of the asylum process used to happen after somebody had already arrived at the border. So this is an issue of being detained and then what happens within the United States. Many of the Trump administration policies are trying to push people into a situation where they don't even make it into the United States. So there's several examples of that. The bottom half of the screen is a graphic of what the asylum process is starting to look like now. It's not fully implemented. Some of these are not fully implemented, but this is how they're trying to transform the asylum process. You'll see there's still people who are fleeing their countries. We're increasingly actually receiving people from Venezuela who are fleeing the political unrest there. But the U.S. government is now pressuring and supporting the Mexican government and many other Central American governments to detain people before they even make it to the U.S.-Mexico border. There's more situations in which Central Americans or others aren't making it up to the U.S.-Mexico border because they're being detained and deported by Mexican immigration. This is very much a ramp-up of Mexican immigration that's been supported, encouraged, coerced from the U.S. perspective. The second policy that people who are arriving towards the border are now subject to is something that we call turnbacks. So it used to be that people who fled their country, they arrived to the port of entry at the U.S.-Mexico border, and they would say, I'm seeking asylum, I'm afraid of returning, and at that point they'd be detained. Now they're being forced to wait in Mexico until CBP says that they have capacity to bring them in. So in Nogales, for example, we have people who are waiting 2 months before they can even begin the asylum process. So before they're officially registered by CBP, they have to wait in Nogales, Mexico for 2 months. And then they're detained at the border. This is where the third policy that's really important is coming in, and this is cited in the talking points, but just to give you a sense of where it comes in the process. After somebody is detained at the border, whether they've presented at the port of entry or whether they were detained by Border Patrol when they were crossing, in many cases they're now being sent back to Mexico to wait for their immigration court hearings. That's the policy called Remain in Mexico. So instead of being able to stay with family members or community in the United States as they're awaiting their court decisions, they're instead homeless in Mexico, and the kids are out of school, there's not a lot of support for them as far as a place to live, and there's a lot of violence and insecurity in the cities that they're being returned to, which include cities like Laredo or Matamoros, that the U.S. government actually has a travel warning telling U.S. citizens not to go to those cities. that's where we're sending people back to wait for their immigration court hearings. So all of these policies are aimed to stop people from being able to pursue their asylum cases from within the United States. And then the other policy to be aware of is this expansion of detention, which is discussed in the talking points, both an expansion of adult detention to more than 50,000 people now who are being held in detention, as well as an effort by the Trump administration to detain families, so detain moms and kids and dads and kids in family detention centers. And this is something that's actually already affecting us. We used to very rarely have families go to family detention, and just in the last week or two, we've had a notable increase in the number of families that after they've been detained at the border are being sent to family detention instead of being released into the community. So all of these policies, again, are designed to generate despair, and they're designed to keep people in Central America, in northern Mexico cities, or in detention, instead of them really affording them the access to a legitimate asylum legal case in the U.S. and then a court decision. And I'm happy, just as I think Chris mentioned, we're happy to answer questions afterwards. So if you have questions about these specific policies, please save them and let us know at the end of the webinar. This is a bleak portrait of the current process, the current detention and asylum process. And as you prepare to go to Capitol Hill and advocate on these policies, I think the key question we have to reflect on is, what can congressional representatives actually do? One of the dilemmas that we're facing is that many of those policies I just mentioned, like turnbacks, like remain in Mexico, like the expansion of detention, they're being proposed and they're being implemented by the executive branch. So that is the President and the Department of Homeland Security. And the executive branch is not consulting with Congress or even seeking out congressional approval for these policies. Another policy that I didn't bring up in essence because there's not a lot of power that we have over it, but is to prevent people from accessing asylum if they've gone through another country on their way to the U.S. So for example, we have a Cameroonian asylum seeker who's currently in detention that because he went through Mexico on his way to the United States and didn't seek asylum in Mexico, he's now not eligible for asylum in the U.S. But these are all policies that are being proposed by the executive branch. There was never a law passed by Congress that said this specific information. So when you go to the Capitol Hill and you're advocating on these policies, it's really important to reflect on what are the levers that we do have power over. The number one area in which Congress has power is in appropriations, so funding. The timing actually of the teach-in is really important for the appropriations or budget process in Congress, because the Congress has passed a continuing resolution, which means they're keeping more or less the same levels of funding. And it's looking like near the end of November or early December is when there's going to be a large debate and maybe even a government shutdown over the funding for these different kinds of immigration enforcement policies. So the timing of the visits that we're doing is really essential to try to influence your senators and representatives to fund the priorities that we want and not those that we are opposed to. That means there's a couple of ways that Congress can do that. They could reduce funding, restrict funding, or set conditions. So we're really pushing for Congress to defund certain programs, such as the Remain in Mexico program, and we're pushing for them to restrict how the executive branch uses their funding, because Congress has been appropriating actually not a reasonable amount, but they've been limiting, for example, the number of detention beds that the Department of Homeland Security can use, but the Department of Homeland Security has disregarded that limitation and has pulled funding from other sources. So we really want our congressional offices to say, to reinforce the checks and balances of government and put more specific restrictions on how these funds can be spent, and say if we're only going to allocate funds for 34,000 detention beds, then Department of Homeland Security is not allowed to transfer money to detain more individuals. So again, it gets a little bit technical when it comes to funding, but the basic principle is if the government doesn't have money to implement problematic policies, then it won't be possible for them to implement those policies. So we want to advocate for our congressional offices to limit that kind of funding. And then a couple of other congressional levers. One is oversight. So you can ask your offices to request these investigations into the conditions in detention and into these policies that are related to asylum seekers. And it's still valuable for Congress to propose and pass bills that we call messaging bills. So they're bills that are our ideal of what could happen. But that's important because many years down the line, those bills might get taken back up and they might actually become law. It's a way to generate some public awareness as well as pressure on the executive branch on particular issues. So for example, we support the Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act, which is largely a messaging bill. It's unlikely that it's going to pass, but it's really important to encourage your offices to support it and to co-sponsor it, because if it gains some momentum, it can change our conversation around immigration detention. So there are opportunities for hope in the midst of this process that's largely focused on detention and deportation and deterrence. But we don't want to just focus on asylum and policies at the border, because ultimately we look at root causes because our hope is to help people stay close to where they were born. So we talk a lot in the Jesuit networks about the right to not migrate. And that's what, when we use this word root causes, that's really what we're talking about, is we want to give people the right to not migrate. And there's some discussion in your talking points about elements of root causes and pieces we want to ask for. I think it's very appropriate that we talk about root causes in the context of the Ignatian Family Teach-In, because the Ignatian Family Teach-In exists as a result in many ways of U.S. intervention in Central America in the past that continues to be responsible for our current challenges. So we as a Jesuit family, as an Ignatian family, can speak uniquely to the importance not just of aid to Central America, but very specific aid that is helpful and not harmful. Because we've seen, unfortunately, the harmful consequences of the U.S. focusing on military aid to Central America. Instead, what we're suggesting is having the United States invest in violence prevention programs, anti-corruption efforts, including the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which was very successful in investigating corruption in that country and was shut down for political reasons because they investigated a little bit too much corruption, and the leaders, the presidents and leaders of that country didn't appreciate it, and the United States didn't speak out when that panel was shut down. So instead of just talking about root causes in the sense of let's send more money to Central America, we want to be specific in saying where do we want those funds to go. We want them to go to violence prevention, we want them to go to anti-corruption, and we don't just want them to go to military aid. And many of you are doing congressional visits related to the two priorities of the IFTJ, both the environment and immigration. And talking about root causes is an important point in which you can link those two topics, because climate change is already affecting communities in Central America and is already a reason for migration. So we as the United States both need to address the causes of climate change, both need to reduce emissions and sign on to these international agreements, but we also need to provide aid to mitigate these impacts. So to mitigate the impact of drought in Guatemala, for example. And that's an opportunity for your group to come together on the two issue areas. Ultimately, a fourth point to make would be that while it's very important for the United States to invest in Central America on the different areas that we're suggesting, we don't want the U.S. to use international assistance as a tool to force Central American governments to restrict migration. So that's unfortunately the direction that the very small amount of aid that's going to Central America is being used as a tool to force governments to restrict migration instead of used to try to prevent migration in the first place, or instead of being used in broader terms. It's really important when we're talking about aid to Central America to realize that the Trump administration has limited the has frozen development funds to Central America. So last year, Congress appropriated money that was supposed to go to some of these programs that I'm naming, and the Trump administration has put a freeze on that aid. So there a lot of programs, USAID, Catholic Relief Services, are running out of budget. So they're unable to help communities in Guatemala that are affected by the drought, for example, because of this freeze on aid. And what we want Congress to do this year is when they appropriate those funds for the development programs, that they put in the statute that the administration is required to spend these funds. So in the past, they've said they may spend this money. We want them to say that they are required to spend the money so that the Trump administration has to follow the will of Congress and respect that appropriate check and balance on our government structure. And again, I'm happy to answer more questions on that. I think because my Zoom went out, you can't see my screen anymore. But I'm going to try one more time so you can get the websites that I wanted to suggest to you. Can you see that?
We can't, Joanna, but if you...
We'll send it out later.
Yeah, if you email it, we'll get it posted with the...
And my email address, but websites on aid to Central America, on asylum, and on general immigration legal issues.
Great. All right. Thanks, Joanna. And we'll come back to you with some questions in a minute, okay? Excellent. All right. Now we're going to turn it over to Jose Cabrera. Jose is, as I mentioned, the Director of Education Advocacy. Oh, wait, I see. Well, anyway, the slides appeared now. But Jose is the Director of Education Advocacy at the Ignatian Solidarity Network here at ISN. So we're going to turn it over to Jose and try to get his video to appear. So let's turn it over to Jose to talk about interior issues. All right, Jose, go for it.
Great, thank you. So I have so when we talk about interior, I think the biggest thing that I want to talk about, and I think a lot of us want to talk about, is large-scale raids and family separation. And as Joanna was mentioning, during the appropriation process, this is where some of the hardships come from. So in the appropriation process, there's a significant amount of money that goes into ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and for immigrants, we kind of see them as like the immigration police, and they are able, with the large amount of money that they get from appropriation bills, they're able to have a large operation raid, like they did this past summer in Mississippi, where they arrested about 680 folks from multiple food processing plants in Mississippi. And these large-scale raids have been happening for a very long time, since I was a little boy. And I remember there was one that happened right outside Cincinnati and scattered the whole immigrant community in Cincinnati because of that raid. And so because of raids like that, they're also able to operate small raids in communities where they're able to go into homes and areas and use many tactics, like having a fake warrant for arrest, or even having a warrant for someone who probably doesn't live in a house or in an area, and they go and attempt to arrest as many undocumented immigrants as possible. In the process of this, you have families that are being separated from, I'm sure many of you read a lot of the articles once the Mississippi raid happened last summer, of hundreds of children left alone without any care because both parents were picked up. And so all of this kind of deportation, massive raid machine gets fueled by the appropriation process that Joanna was mentioning, that happens every year in Congress. And so when you are all going up to the Hill to advocate for immigration justice, when we look about interior or internal enforcement, that is the biggest thing that we are going to be talking about, and that in the document sheets, the talking points, the backgrounders that ISN is sharing, that is what we are telling you all to talk about, and we're sharing information with you all about what is going on in those regards. The other big piece that is currently happening right now in Interior is the attempt to end the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, the Temporary Protective Status Program, or TPS, and the Deferred Enforced Departure, or DED program, in that was started throughout many past administrations. DACA, as many of you know, started by the Obama administration, and TPS and DED started as early as the early 90s for Salvadorian immigrants who were who were here in the United States when the big earthquake happened in Salvador, and then immigrants who have come since then. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about DACA, because I feel like a good portion of you all have a sense of what DACA is and what's going on. But if you have any questions, please ask me. I want to spend more time explaining what TPS and DED is. So TPS, it is kind of like DACA. You get a temporary work status that you are issued, that each country is issued for a certain amount of years, and it is all with the discretion of the Secretary of Homeland Security. And so there are, if I'm remembering correctly, but I wouldn't quote me on this, there are 9 countries that are protected under a TPS. Many of them are from Central America, a few are from the Middle East, and 1 or 2 from African countries. And so what each people who qualify for TPS, they apply, and they're all have to wait and have TPS and have some form of work permit until they have to redesignate. And so what happened was that this administration decided to not redesignate TPS for pretty much all of the countries that are protected in TPS. And DED, Deferred Enforced Departure, is kind of a special program within TPS. It was given to folks who are from Liberia, and it was at some point in the Bush administration, they didn't want to give Liberians TPS, so they decided to design this new program called DED. And what happens with DED is, if you are from Liberia and you want to get a work permit, you have to apply for the work permit. If you don't want a work permit, then you will stay undocumented. And if you ever picked up from ICE and you're put in deportation procedures and you're from Liberia and you qualify for DED, the DED appears and your deportation is stopped. So they as well they wanted to just end DED altogether, and it wasn't part of the redesignation. And so because of all this going on, there have been multiple lawsuits against the Trump administration saying how this is wrong. And many of the different lawsuits have been positive. And what we see now today is that because even though the lawsuits were positive in favor for TPS, and DED actually has not been in a lawsuit yet, just to put that out there. But so since the lawsuits have been positive, but yet the Supreme Court hasn't taken a decision, it's up to, again, the discretion of Department of Homeland Security. And as of now, there's no clear signs or evidence that the department is going to redesignate TPS for many of the countries that TPS is protected under. So there are many individuals that may next year may lose their TPS status. So that is the current situation. Now, when you're going up to the Hill and you're going to be lobbying, when you talk about the amount of appropriation and funding, we want to say stuff like reduce funding for ICE and ensure that ICE doesn't get any more money that will allow them to do this harmful practices that they have been doing to immigrant communities. We also want to specify that we want Congress to create a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients, TPS, and DED holders. But we do not want, and we have to be very clear about this, we do not want any negotiation of the protection for DACA recipients, TPS, and DED holders be attached to money going, increasing enforcement to ICE or building a wall. Because what that would do and will be just harming our immigrant communities and in a way throwing people under the bus. So please be very clear about that they're two separate things. To reduce funding for ICE and ensuring that DED, TPS, and DACA have a pathway to citizenship and they're not attached to each other.
All right, thank you, Jose. We now have some time for questions. Again, if you joined us late and you're trying to kind of find the materials we've been talking about today, you can go to ignationsolidarity.net/IFTJ. Under the agenda button, there's a link to the Advocacy Day page, and you'll find the backgrounders for both of our issue areas. I'm going to invite people. I think it's easiest if people submit any questions you have via the chat. So in your Zoom window, you'll see a chat button on the bottom there of the Zoom window, and you can click on that and pose a question to us. Really quickly, just while we're waiting for some folks to submit a question or two, Joanna, a lot has changed at the border over the past year in terms of the reality. You mentioned Remain in Mexico or MPP. There have been other pieces. Can you just talk about ways that people, maybe kind of reiterate ways that people's situation who are coming to the border, as well as those who are being deported and ending up on the Mexican side of the U.S.-Mexico border, ways that their reality has become, in many ways, more challenging as the policies have changed, particularly over the past year.
Yeah, it's it's one thing to talk about how policies have changed, and another to understand just what's the human impact of that. So I think a couple of examples that I can give. Folks used to be in border cities just for maybe a few days, maybe a week, and now that they're 2 months stranded in a border city, that means that kids are outside of school for oftentimes 4 to 5 months between the time that they left their town, the time that they're at the border, and then by the time they get to school in the U.S. So they're almost missing a whole year of school in this limbo in the border, and they have no structured activities whatsoever. If they're lucky, then their parents have a smartphone that they can watch a video on, but they don't have anything that they're doing in that period of time, and it's really destructive for them just in the child development and their ability to interact with other kids. We have a lot of conflicts between kids as they take out some of this trauma and anxiety on each other. And then people are in a very precarious humanitarian situation, so they don't have a place to live. They're oftentimes in overcrowded shelters. So in a shelter that has capacity for 100 but might be housing 200 or 300. And in other parts of the border, not in Nogales, but in other parts of the border, they're actually camping out in essentially tents. So if you think about some of the homeless encampments that you've seen in the United States, but then add a large number of children and add the fact that that's a city where they're being targeted. We've had, not in Nogales again, but in other cities in particular, multiple reports of kidnapping, of robbery, and people who have just told me, who have been returned, for example, under MPP and WADAs, and who have said, I just can't go back there. I won't survive if I go back there. So it's both the, on one level is just the child development, their future and their education, and on another level is it even possible for people to survive and to live? And these policies are designed to make that more and more impossible.
Thanks, Joanna. And Jose, what about on the interior side, in terms of folks who are here in the country, have been here in the country? You talked a little bit about this, but what parallels or connections you make to what Joanna was sharing about folks at the border that you say, you're seeing and hearing from communities here in the U.S.?
One of the biggest things that I think is very scary is that because a lot of times ICE ends up working with police departments and sheriff departments, that it makes it hard for them to report a crime, and it makes it hard for them to feel part of the community in that sense. So I think that's one of the biggest things that it fears. But I think it's also that trauma that people are facing, the trauma of not wanting to leave your house because you feel that at any moment you can get detained. Children, that internal fear of worrying if their parents will be home when after school. And so all of that trauma makes it hard for them to focus in school. All of that trauma makes it hard for just people to live their life and feel like they're are welcomed in this country.
Thanks, Jose. And maybe just one other quick question. Both of you have spent time on the Hill meeting with congressional staff. Sometimes you have congressional staff, Joanna, that even come down to Nogales to visit and learn about the situation at the border firsthand. But can you give any advice in terms of talking with staffers in particular, maybe members as well, about these issues and what you find to be the most effective strategies to them?
Yeah, I think it's everybody's in a different place when they're approaching it. If you're intimidated, it's always important to remember that these are folks who work for you and that their job is to listen to you. So whether they're doing that well or not is another matter, but walking in with that attitude of I am this person's boss and they want to listen to me. And so have some confidence in your position and the power you have with the Jesuit network. And then I think the other part is to focus a lot on the stories and how these realities are impacting someone that's close to you. Even if that person that's close to you is actually 1,000 miles away at the border, what the office wants to hear if they're in an office in Wisconsin and they're in Minnesota or in New York is, why does this matter for us? And why should this be a concern for us? And so to the extent that you can make that connection, whether it's just saying, we're a Jesuit community and we have partners that are there, or we have families who have family members in this situation, the most that you can make a connection and explain to them why that matters for this particular office, the more compelling that office will find it. And then the third part of advice that's related is that focus on testimony and story, I think, is the most memorable. We had a staff person from our senator's office, Senator Sinema, come down, and who is a very, he thought through a lot of issues, but was very much in an intellectual space. And the opportunity to hear people's stories moved him deeply. And I think he continues to be processing that visit, and we're waiting to see how that will be manifested in policy. But to the extent that you can emotionally move the person you're talking to, that can be more memorable to them maybe than the other 10 visits that they have scheduled on that particular day.
Sure. And would you say that's true? There's a lot of, in kind of the scope of dialogue around issues of immigration, often in the context of the work of the church, we use the word hospitality and thinking about how we can be a place of welcome for people, especially those who are seeking refuge from danger or grave poverty, things like that. But for all people who seek to to be part of our country and things like that. But there's also a perspective of an emphasis on security, and you know, it's kind of we hear it most loudly in the call to establish a more, you know, significant border wall, right? Do you find that you know, are there effective strategies that kind of to talk about that contrast between a concept of hospitality and a concept of security that often can sound like they're divisive?
So we actually use the term usually safety rather than security, because I think that's something that can bridge those two. So we want to promote safety at the border. We want to promote safety in our own communities. And that gets to, I think, oftentimes when we talk about security, it comes from a place of fear, and sometimes well-grounded fears, sometimes not well-grounded fears. When we're talking about safety as a common cause, as this is a deeper shared value, then we're able to show and discuss that there are ways that we can approach the border that promote safety. It's not that we're against all border policies whatsoever. That there are ways we can approach the border that promote safety, and also by promoting safety for families that are arriving, that can be something that advances our community. So that's one of those key words that's a little bit less divisive or less easily divided into the two categories. And I think it's important to remember that it depends a lot on the office that you're meeting with. You might be, if you're meeting with an office that is very opposed to your stance on many of these issues, then the best thing to do is to start to raise questions, start to just raise a few doubts. It doesn't mean that you're going to get them to switch their whole framework of thinking, but maybe they can start to question, well, how could my community be safer? Is this the right approach? And that, even them raising a few questions can be a really productive visit. A good visit doesn't mean that they necessarily have to walk out the door and co-sponsor 10 bills. It could be just a few seeds of questions that are planted that later on, 6 months from now or a year from now, could bear further fruit.
Great. And Jose, I was thinking that emphasis on the idea of safety, it really resonates when we talk about communities here in the United States as well, that everybody wants safety, or wants to live in a safe community. And so a lot of conversations can revolve around how do we create a safe community for everyone who's there, regardless of their immigration status or where they come from, and things like that as well. So, all right. Thank you so much to both of you. Again, Joanna Williams, Director of Education and Advocacy for the Kino Border Initiative in Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, and Jose Cabrera, Director of Education and Advocacy. Those titles are very similar. Director of Education and Advocacy for Migration at the Ignatian Solidarity Network. This recording will be posted. We'll also post Joanna's slides and any other related materials in about 2 days. By the end of this week, we'll have that available at the latest. And again, you can find those resources for Advocacy Day at ignatiansolidarity.net/IFTJ/advocacy-day. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much to both of you. And we look forward to seeing everyone in Washington, D.C. next month. Thanks and have a great night.